Welcome. We are so glad that you could join us today for our digital lunch and learn with Dr. Kueny out of the psychological department at Missouri S&T. Dr. Kueny earned her Bachelor's of Science in Psychology and Political Science with a minor in Statistics from Truman State University. She finished her graduate program, her master's and PhD in Industrial and Organizational Psychology from St. Louis University with a concentration in quantitative methods and behavioral science. She joined S&T as an assistant professor in 2016, and in August of 2020, she now serves as the assistant chair of graduate programs in the department, including the program director for the Industrial Organizational Graduate Program. She currently teaches Intro to IO Psych, Organizational Change and Development, and Employee Affect and Behavior at the graduate level. We are really excited to have her join us today, where we're going to talk about personal exchanges at work and how we can help them to be more positive and to really work through those negative interpersonal dynamics in the workplace. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Kueny. If you've got any questions, sorry, I forgot one thing. If you've got any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat and just preface it with question, and we'll find it and get those answered at the end.
Thanks, Sylvia. I'll go ahead and share screen here. We'll get started. And all right. Can you guys see the correct slides, not the speaker slide deck?
Yep.
Great. Okay. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for coming to Lunch and Learn today. And that I was saying that music leading up to this was very relaxing. I feel very zen to give this presentation now. So Sylvia gave a great introduction. I'll just give a little bit brief blurb about myself as well. But yes, this talk is on interpersonal dynamics, reducing workplace conflict. As Sylvia mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in psychological science, and I'm an IO psychologist by training. So in general, IO psychologists specialize in effective employee behaviors and balancing employee needs and employee effectiveness with the organization's bottom line and organization effectiveness as well. So those are the things that I teach at the graduate level. And in particular, I specialize in study interpersonal dynamics surrounding what we refer to oftentimes as discretionary work behaviors. So that includes things like counterproductive work behaviors. It includes initiative or proactive behaviors. And I'm really interested and focused in on studying not just, the negative or positive impacts of these behaviors on ourselves, the people who carry them out, but how they impact others around us as well. And I also do some work in healthcare in terms of understanding healthcare processes and how we can improve healthcare for the betterment of healthcare employee work experiences. That's just sort of an aside too. But today I'm specifically going to be talking about negative interpersonal dynamics at work. Often referred, there's a number of labels. It's a specific type of counterproductive work behavior, though, directed at individuals, at other people. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of labels that sort of encompass bullying or conflict or negative interpersonal dynamics at work. The broad term in the literature is counterproductive work behaviors directed at the individual, or CWBIs. But more specifically, we see other terms used a lot. You'll notice one of the terms I don't have up here is harassment. That term is also used, but oftentimes gets mixed in with sexual harassment, and we're kind of talking about that's a very specific and important area, but targeted area of harassment. And we're talking about other types of bullying, conflict, and harassment at work today. So one of the first labels we have and types of conflict we can see at work is social undermining. And social undermining is an intention to diminish someone by diminishing or sabotaging their workplace relationships, by diminishing their successes, by diminishing their reputation in some way. So this might look like openly questioning someone out of malice in a meeting just to prove a point, or in some way downplaying things that they've earned, or making it look like that they are less capable or should not be as involved as they should be in decision making, or or things like that. And we'll talk about abusive supervision in a second, but social undermining is actually one of the few behaviors where we see subordinates can actually target supervisors. So the power imbalance is a little different, where we can see subordinates try to social undermine supervisors that they don't like. But we also see coworkers social undermine each other as well. So lateral social undermining. Incivility is sort of just a generic term that is used to describe low intensity interpersonal deviance. So it's just the generic sort of like being rude, being discourteous, just sort of like kind of rubbing you the wrong way sort of vibe. Interpersonal conflict is also somewhat vague, but tends to include concepts such as like more aggressive behavior, like yelling in a meeting, or having a really heated discussion, feeling verbally attacked. And interpersonal conflict is a two-way street. So by definition, it requires both people are sort of targeting each other. We also see the term bullying, and bullying does have a very specific concept, which is that this is a long-term dynamic of negative interpersonal dynamics. This is long-term conflict, long-term incivility, long-term social undermining. So it's considered bullying when it's been occurring repetitiously for 6 or more months. And this 6+ months of exposure to negative acts includes things like aggression, but also social exclusion, so purposely ostracizing or leaving people out, making offensive remarks, teasing, ridiculing the person. And it's pretty open. After about, this extended period of time, it becomes pretty apparent when bullying is occurring. And then we have abusive supervision. And abusive supervision is sort of not the flip of social undermining, but it is the direction of supervisor specifically targeting a subordinate in some way. And so it's all these things. It's incivility, interpersonal conflict, social undermining, but specifically with the power imbalance of a supervisor targeting or being negative towards a subordinate in some way. And most of these, again, you'll notice avoid bullying might include some physical aggression. Most of these other terms, though, otherwise, we're also not really including physical aggression. That falls more under the term of workplace violence. So that's again in the separate from like harassment as well. And then finally, more recently with the pandemic, we've seen an increase in the workplace in this concept of virtual bullying. Virtual bullying, we've seen a lot in social media, in like the social world online, but we've seen an increase of virtual bullying in workplaces since the pandemic and since the increase of online virtual work and things like that. And that's trolling people through Zoom meetings, being negative to them in Zoom chats. For large companies that use Slack or Microsoft Teams, it might mean, being rude and discourteous and targeting people in those virtual contexts. So it's essentially incivility and social undermining and bullying, but just through all of our virtual mechanisms. So these are all the different terms. This is what bullying and conflict can kind of look like at work. It doesn't sound great, and it's not great. The negative impacts of these behaviors is pretty noticeable, right? So it might surprise some people to know just how psychologically distressing bullying and conflict like this can be. We found that it's actually related to anxiety, depression, and noticeable mental health concerns. It's absolutely related to employee burnout and emotional exhaustion, which is one of the critical predictors of employee turnover. So if you're burning out your employees or emotionally exhausting them, they're also more likely to leave your organization. And in fact, there's been a direct relationship between bullying and PTSD-like symptoms, especially more extreme bullying cases. But people can be bullied for a considerable amount of time and experience very similar PTSD symptoms without any intervention sometimes. It's really crazy. And of course, we have negative emotions and reduced job attitudes, so lower job satisfaction, lower self-esteem at work, lower lower beliefs that you feel like you matter, that you contribute, that you bring value, all of these things. And we also see reduced physiological functioning. So people who experiencing these stressors at work experience sleep problems. They even experience musculoskeletal pain and like psychosymptomatic sort of pain throughout. We see people with reduced immune functioning, ulcers, that kind of thing, because your body enters into a fight or flight mode, reduces cortisol or increases cortisol levels and puts a lot of strain on your heart, and then thus your immune system, and things over time start to deteriorate. So it is really critical from a physiological perspective too. And we see incivility spirals. So we see, people, right, are negative to a person, and that person's negative to a person, or back to a person, and it sort of just keeps going and keeps going, and it's a sort of continuous spiral, just being negative towards each other. And as you might expect, if your employees are experiencing these things, you're going to see significant organizational impacts as well. You see reduced performance from your employees in terms of task performance, but also in terms of those extra things we hope to see from people, like creativity and citizenship behaviors. They don't have the energy, they don't have the resources, they don't have the drive to want to go above and beyond and be courteous and do more for the organization. And that really hurts a company as well. We also see those higher counterproductive work behaviors in terms of increased revenge and sabotage towards others, but also things like withdrawing from work. So increased absences, leaving early, coming in late, really just dragging feet and just not wanting to be there, which is a reduction in performance and a reduction in overall functioning for the organization. And a lot of times this creates what we refer to as hostile work environments or toxic cultures. And there's significant indirect costs that come with a hostile work environment, including really high turnover, which is extremely costly for organizations, eventual possibility for lawsuits, and things like that. And in fact, there's been some cost analyses here to suggest that a company loses $17,000 per year per bullied employee that they have at their workplace. So of course we want, from my perspective, I'm like, the individual impacts are enough why we should care about this and more should be done to address it. But of course there's cost impacts as well. And then there's crossover and spillover effects. So it can impact our work-life structures. We take that anger and frustration home, bring it to families or loved ones outside of work. It impacts other working relationships. We become more difficult in working with our other coworkers when we're bullied and experience negative conflict. So there's a lot of like rippling effects of this as well. So why does it occur? Well, a lot of times people think it's the bully and it's the perpetrator characteristics, and then some question about victim characteristics as well. And there is some research to support that. Perpetrators are known to be higher in trait anger and trait hostility, so they tend to just be angrier people. They tend to be higher in narcissism, so they tend to think more highly of themselves while coincidentally having a lower sense of self-esteem. So that creates threatening situations for them, and then they lash out and react. They tend towards a mindset of vengefulness, and seeking revenge seems like an appropriate coping mechanism from their viewpoint. And oftentimes they're targets of bullying themselves. Interestingly, the research suggests that victim characteristics are not actually that different from perpetrator characteristics. And sometimes this is concerning because people believe this sounds a lot like victim blaming. But it's important to sort of recognize some of the patterns we see, which is that, again, victims tend to also be higher in trait anger and hostility. They tend to be more disagreeable, so it's easier for people to be uncivil to or socially undermine those that they find as disagreeable in the first place. It's easier to have conflict, someone who also comes off as aggressive. And it's really, we see among coworkers, high performers are targeted. So especially the attempts to like socially undermine high performers is a big part of this. Except for abusive supervision, in which case it's the low performers that are targeted. So abusive supervisors tend to target low performers instead. But really why the bigger reasons why we see this kind of aggression at work is the organizational context. So you can look at perpetrator and victim characteristics, and that can be helpful if you're dealing with a very specific situation. But broadly, if you have a negative conflict issue at work, it's probably because there's some organizational context issues at play. So stressful work environments really facilitate a negative work environment, which then facilitates these kind of behaviors. So role stressors, when people feel like they don't know what their role is, or that there's conflict in their roles, or they're overloaded, they may take it out on others. They may, think that the reason their role is ambiguous is because their coworker doesn't communicate well with them, and then they take it out on the coworker. But there may be other reasons why their role is ambiguous. If they're feeling overloaded, or if they have conflict and then someone else asks something of them, that might elicit a conflict reaction in some way. If people feel like they are overloaded and also don't have the autonomy to manage their work, and they don't have a lot of decision making, they tend to lash out as well. So low autonomy can create these sort of stressful environments. And then absolutely workplace injustice, and specifically interpersonal injustice and procedural injustice. When people feel like they're not treated with respect and dignity, which is interpersonal justice, and when they feel like procedures are unfair or disproportionately implemented, which is procedural justice. Interestingly, distributive justice, so do I think my outcomes fairly equate to outcomes of others, can contribute to conflict, but not as much. People are usually okay with their outcomes if they feel like the procedures are fair, and if they've been treated with respect and dignity in carrying out those procedures, they tend to be okay, even if their outcome isn't as great as they hoped it would be. So really, it's about targeting being respectful and treating people with dignity and having fair procedures above and beyond as everyone get their piece of the pie. Abusive leaders also contribute to conflict, so the abuse of supervision, and then unjust leaders who facilitate unfair procedures, who don't treat their employees with respect and dignity, even when having to deliver bad news. Again, employees don't lash out against bad news. They oftentimes lash out on how the bad news is given. So if it's given in a way that's interpersonally threatening or something to that effect. Laissez-faire and autocratic leaders. So laissez-faire leaders are ones that sort of step back and don't really involve themselves much. And you can kind of see how coworkers can fall into conflict patterns if they don't have a leader who's willing to step in and help manage and navigate the dynamics there. And then autocratic leaders are like the opposite, and they micromanage and are overbearing and create an environment where everyone questions everything and no one trusts the actions of the other. And it's only the autocratic leader can be the one who makes decisions. And so there's a lot of lack of trust in that environment as well. So laissez-faire creates a situation where conflict occurs because there's no one helping coworkers manage when there is, a disagreement, and conflict occurs under autocratic leaders because it's so micromanaging and so threatening, and no one is trusted to make a decision themselves, that people start to distrust decisions made by others and things like that. So what can be done? There are three broad approaches to handling things: primary interventions, secondary interventions, and tertiary interventions. Primary interventions are those that specifically target the root causes of these issues in the first place. So here we're talking about reducing those stressors that create the negative work environment itself, trying to reduce role ambiguity, trying to reduce role conflict in some way, developing a positive culture by training managers on not just how to look out for interpersonal dynamic issues, but also how to help people through the interpersonal dynamic issues. Upholding policies about how people are expected to treat each other at work, and rewarding cooperative behavior. So when instead of rewarding competition, rewarding when people actually work together to achieve things. And it's important to cultivate an awareness of interpersonal impact. And Sylvia, I think, has the link for this crew training. This is a training that was developed by the VA office, and it's used outside of just the VA. but it stands for civility, respect, and engagement in the workplace. And with all primary interventions, and crew training is no different. There's not like a one size fits all, and they'll be very clear about that on their website, that the way it works is they have trained facilitators who come to your organization, do a diagnosis, get a sense of things, and then work through your organization one-on-one on how to like address the specific dynamics you're facing. But the overall approach is, how do we help people recognize the interpersonal impact they have on others? How do we help people recognize that that conflict can actually create really dramatic negative effects for people and things to that effect? If you don't have the resources or can't get the primary interventions targeted, then we can utilize secondary interventions, which are focused on how can we cope with and manage our emotions and deal with the issue in the moment itself. And these are focused on successful coping strategies, like how to avoid behavior escalation, how to engage in effective conflict management through cooperation and things like that. Emotion regulation is really helpful here, and training people on effective emotion regulation is good. So how to reappraise the situation as a victim, to recognize that it's more about the perpetrator and the stressors that they're facing rather than you as the individual. How to situation select, so you maybe don't put yourself in situations that you might come across the perpetrator or things like that. Again, it's not all on the victim to do these things. It's also good for a perpetrator to, think of emotion regulation from a perspective of like, is this really the best reaction? Is the person I'm targeting here really the reason why I'm stressed or unhappy or experiencing negative emotions in some way? So emotion regulation for both parties, right? As a victim or as a perpetrator. Then oftentimes, most often we see tertiary interventions, and these are the ones that are really just focused on the side effects of this. So it doesn't really address the root cause of the conflict, doesn't really address the in the moment how to manage things better. It's sort of like, all right, you're really burnt out. You're experiencing trauma from this bullying, from this conflict, and here's how we can get you some systems, some resources to get better. So having a reporting system for the conflict, having third-party mediation. Oftentimes this is available through an employee assistance program or supervisors who are trained to mediate third-party dynamics and things like that. And then offering counseling and debriefing, especially for those who feel particularly threatened and struggling with conflict in the workplace. They can access that through an employee assistance program as well. And again, I'll just caveat by saying, there's all these different options. It's a matter of if you feel like you're experiencing conflict at work or your organization has conflict issues, whether or not one of these is the right approach is really would require like a focused discussion on like what are the specific dynamics your organization is facing. But these are just some examples about what can be done that research suggests supports reducing conflict. So with that, I will open it up for questions. My email address is here on the slide. If anyone wants to shoot me an email with a question or anything like that. But yeah, thank you guys so much for joining today.
All right, Dr. Kueny, thank you so much. I have the first question I received was, if I am not the boss, how can I as an employee help the conflict I see in my office?
That's a good question. I think a first gut reaction is to get involved and step in. And we certainly, talk about in harassment literature about bystander effects and like when we see harassment, we should step in and things like that. But if you're seeing bullying and conflict, it's helpful to step in and at least say like this, let's take a step back and engage in a more professional dynamic. But I'd say if you really think you're seeing bullying, it's something that you need to approach the supervisor and approach the person who looks like they're being bullied and see, how they're feeling about things. You want to Be cautious though, because again, both the victim and perpetrator might be experiencing heightened negative emotions in the midst of the conflict. You don't want to necessarily add to that. So I would say, don't just be a bystander. Some way try to help, but don't necessarily just insert yourself and start in the conflict either.
All right, thank you. Next question. Can you talk some more about social undermining and what to do if you are the target of it?
Yeah, if you're experiencing social undermining, which is not fun, the first thing to do, I would say, is to engage in some emotion regulation strategies. So to recognize that this person is creating this view of you that's not accurate, that, like to engage in some reappraisal and to recognize that that it's really not true. They're questioning of you, or they're threatening of your relationships or things like that. To take a step back and realize it's probably because of stressors they're experiencing in their own workplace, in their own work view, that's causing them to lash out. And the personal attacks, try to remove yourself as seeing them as personal. And then I would engage in use a reporting system at work. If you feel like it's a systematic issue, like a work culture of like social undermining, at that point it was going to require both it's going to require upper level leadership to really see that this is a systemic problem. If it's a one-on-one basis, I would say first engage in that emotion regulation, recognize that personally it's not you that's the target. They're probably experiencing some own stressors themselves. And then approach your supervisor about how to better address that situation.
All right, thank you. Okay, the next question I received was, how do you manage passive aggressive conflict? Example, persons who impression manage when supervisors are around, but ignore their peers or disregard their input when no one is looking.
I would address that by trying to have an open conversation with the person. Not so much about impression managing while the supervisor's around, but more so if you feel like when the supervisor's not around, that they're not still engaging in you in an effective workplace relationship. I would say try to engage in a professional discussion about, right, like, this is how, this is my perception, this is the way it looks when you don't listen, or it doesn't seem like you're listening to or carrying out the things I've asked of you. I would leave the impression management piece out of that. And just focus specifically on what of their behavior is making work more difficult to go, both directions, and how you think it would be helpful to find a better way to work together in general.
All right, and I'm going to jump to a question that just came in because it kind of relates to it. How do you interact? Escalation can just make it worse, whereas being kind doesn't necessarily work either. Is there a best way to interact?
Yeah, so this is tricky because I think if we look at the characteristics of and how people think about conflict, it's really easy to want to like sort of an eye for an eye sort of mindset, right? And engage in that escalation. And I'd be lying if I'd say like I haven't fallen to that myself once or twice to, just get super angry and frustrated and like yell back or attack back in some way. But typically the best thing, right, is anger oftentimes inserts itself, and emotions make us want to react really quickly to things and re-navigate our behavior. And so again, it's first and foremost emotion regulation. Let's take a step back. Let's take that anger a step back. Wait until maybe you've cooled down a little bit as well, and then find an opportunity to engage that person in a discussion. Be upfront and say, I'd really like to talk about, that disagreement we had. I know I could have handled myself better, but here's how I perceived it. And here's why I'm struggling. And here's where I think I would be really helpful if XYZ happened, and let them have the additional discussion as well from their point of view. But anger, we know, actually, just some like new research we've been working on with some colleagues, is that anger distorts this concept of like blind with rage is actually possibly a thing we hear about all the time in literature and culture, being blind with rage. Anger distorts our ability to effectively understand the outcomes of our behavior. So we tend to overestimate positive things that will happen from our behavior and underestimate negative things that will happen from our behavior. And that includes, retaliation and getting back at people. We think we'll get satisfaction from that, and we really don't. It tends to not happen the way we think it will. So the first thing is to take your own time to check the frustration and check the anger and engage in emotion regulation and think about reappraisal, and then approach the person for an honest conversation about how you're seeing things versus how maybe they're seeing things.
Thank you. Does the research in this area show any trends in terms of gender? Are there patterns with perpetrators or victims?
Yeah, so there are some trends with gender. In general, men tend to be more likely to be perpetrators, because men are, one of the things I don't know if I mentioned clearly is like aggression, aggressive work environments. Men tend to work in traditionally more aggressive work environments, and culturally men are quote allowed to be more aggressive from a gender norm perspective. But we also see women target women as well, and that's not an uncommon phenomenon either, in terms of like perpetrator gender.
All right. We kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but how do you combat social undermining in a systemic culture? How can you break it up?
It depends on where you're at in the systemic culture. So if you are a mid-level to upper level leadership and you're starting to notice that you have a hostile, undermining work environment, you're in a very different position than a frontline employee, so to speak. If you're a frontline employee, hopefully you have a reporting system where you can start to engage your HR in some way to say, like, this is an issue I'm seeing. If you don't feel comfortable going to your supervisor, then the HR, I would say, is the next step to look to address the concern you have. If you're more in a leadership position, you start to see these things, then I'd say it's time to start discussing amongst peer leaders, so other leaders within your organization, and say, I've noticed this issue. We're in a position to make a difference here. How can we do that? Culture change is a very difficult undertaking and a very long and resource intensive process that might start with employee awareness, employee complaints, but ultimately it's going to require leadership involvement as well.
Perfect. All right, next question. You mentioned emotion regulations by both parties, but do you find that perpetrators actually acknowledge that they are indeed being perpetrators?
So that is a tricky conundrum. We do see, especially because perpetrators tend to, there's some trends that perpetrators tend to be more narcissistic, have been victims of bullying themselves. It's sort of a nasty cycle, right? That it's a learned behavior of like, this is how to deal when I feel threatened, and this is how to deal when I feel stressed and frustrated and things like that. That they've learned that this is an approach to address stress and negative emotions, is to lash out and react and target other people because they've been targeted themselves in the past. So it is cyclical in that sense. I think if as an organization is when an organization is willing to take on, or at least a unit is willing to take on some training, the way you can target this is not to say, oh, you've been a perpetrator, you've been a bully, you need to take this emotion regulation training, but to train all employees on how to emotion regulate. And that would include training from both perspectives. So if you find yourself wanting to lash out or find yourself, aggressive towards others or something to that effect, this is how you can navigate those emotions better. Whether or not perpetrators really self-identify, I don't not necessarily know, but if you target the unit and target broadly emotion regulation strategies and train on that across the board as like from both perspectives, you might then ultimately see improvement in that way. One of the things about harassment and bullying is that sometimes to target the cases about, the best approach is to broadly, train and target the whole unit so that everyone walks away with a better understanding of how to handle these situations and handle these dynamics.
I think that was our last question. Dr. Kueny, thank you for joining us today. I know her thank you slide is still up here on the screen, so if you have further questions, her email is there. I also want to share with you some additional items that we have coming up. Here is a link to our speaker series. We will be hearing from our Chancellor, Dr. Mo Dagani, next week. He'll be talking about leading in uncertain times and lessons from COVID-19. If you're interested in the Industrial Organizational Psychology program at Missouri S&T through our distance education program, I've posted that link in the chat as well. Feel free to take a look and see what's out there. We really thank you for joining us today and hope that you had a great time and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.